I'm honoured to be joined this week by Professor Dame Sue Black, who is one of the world's leading anatomists and forensic anthropologists. Dame Black has such a long and distinguished career that I need to give a very truncated version of it and still need to refer to my notes for it. So she received an honours degree in human anatomy and a PhD from the University of Aberdeen before taking up a position as a lecturer at St Thomas Hospital in London. That is how her career in forensic anthropology started, and she was later appointed a Professor of Anatomy and Forensic Anthropology at Dundee University. While there, she was the creator and director of the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, and she's also worked with the BBC on the programme History Cold Case, analysing dead bodies from the past to try and figure out what caused their death. She's been an advisor to crime authors, as well as being a best-selling author herself, with the book All That Remains, as well as other publications, including Written in Bone and 30-Second Forensic Science. She was made a Dame in the 2016 Queen's Birthday Honours, and her current role is as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Engagement at Lancaster University. Sue, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this. And that was a very kind introduction, so thank you.
You are very welcome. So what does your current role with Lancaster University involve?
Oh, it's a really odd one because I have the kind of job that splits into different sections. And as you so very kindly said in my past, I've very much been a scientist, and this role is very much more about management in terms of the university. But one of the really important things about STEM subjects, but really any subject in a university, is being able to communicate it, to be able to engage with other people. So part of my job as being Pro-Vice Chancellor for Engagement is to go out there and talk to people, which is a great job. So, you know, if people say to me, well, what does engagement mean? And I say, well, you know, there's a very good reason why you become engaged before you get married. It's about the relationships that you develop with people, whether you decide that you want to work with that person or not, whether you think, well, they're not for me, let's move on. It is about finding those relationships for the university that allows us to create new opportunities, whether that's in job creation or it's in research and development, working with businesses, working with the government. It's a very big change of role for me, and I've really enjoyed the challenge that it brings.
That's good to hear that you enjoy getting out and speaking to people. And it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about STEM. So I'd also said in the introduction there that you were a forensic anthropologist for the majority of your career. Can you tell us then a bit about what being a forensic anthropologist involves, or what forensic anthropology is?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the two words, because I think, you know, the answer is in the title. The forensic bit is Latin, comes from the word forensis, which means pertaining to the forum, and the forum were the courts of Rome. So anything that has the word forensic in front of it means that you're an expert witness to the court. You go into the court, you're allowed to have an opinion, and you're therefore helping the jury come to their decision on somebody's guilt or otherwise. And the second part of the word is anthropology, and that's Greek. So we've got a Latin word and we've got a Greek word. And the anthropology is the study of the human. So if you put them together, forensic anthropology is really about the study of the human, or what remains of the human, for the purposes of the courts. And sometimes people will ask you, what's the difference then between a forensic anthropologist and a forensic pathologist? Because we're all very used to pathologists from television programs and those sorts of things. And primarily in the UK, a forensic pathologist is somebody who studied medicine. And their job is about the cause of death and the manner of death. And of course, those can be two very different things. So the manner of death may be that somebody was hit with a blunt instrument, but the cause of death was fracture and blood loss, for example. So because they're medically qualified, they're able to give that opinion on manner and cause of death. What the forensic anthropologist does is, our job is to say, who was that person when they were alive? So for us, it's about identity, because if you have a body and you don't know who that person is, then it's very difficult for the police or any other authority to investigate the circumstances surrounding that death, So if we can come back and say, we think this is Joe Bloggs, the police can then go away and speak to Joe Bloggs' mother or the people that Joe Bloggs worked with and start to build up the picture of what might have happened to him. But the pathologist will tell you how they died.
Okay, so before we get more into what led you into forensic anthropology, which sounds fascinating from that, and I didn't know the difference between the forensic anthropologist and forensic pathologist, so it's been a great learning curve for me here as well. But what first got you interested in STEM when you were younger?
It was my teacher. It was my school teacher. So I am the greatest supporter of school teachers that you can find on the planet. I had the most marvelous biology teacher, Dr. Fraser, and I simply adored him because he had huge passion for his subject and he gave you his full attention. And I just loved being in his classes. And he sent me off to the local hospital for a couple of days of work experience. And I came back to the school and I said to him, that's what I want to do, Dr. Fraser. I want to be a medical laboratory technician, which is what I'd gone away. And he said, no, you're not. You're going to university. And I didn't know that I could, because nobody in my family had ever gone to university before, and I didn't really know what it meant. But because I idolized him, because he was such a fantastic teacher, if he said I was going, then I had to go. And so literally it was my biology teacher. And I had the most marvelous moment a few years ago where my school asked me to come back and to give a talk to the school. And unbeknownst to me, they had taken him out of retirement and he was sitting in the audience. And it was just such a shock and a moment, you know, to see, because I knew I didn't look the same. But of course, he looked exactly the same to me as when I was a child. And somebody in the audience said that very question that you've just given, you know, how did you get into this? And it was so wonderful to be able to point to him and say, because of that man, because he believed in me, because he had such a passion and a commitment for a subject. That's infectious when you have young, curious minds. And for me, a good teacher is the most important inspiration that any child can have for where they want to go with their career.
And as you started pursuing that career that he had kind of led you down the path of and going to university, what then led you into forensic anthropology?
It was an accident in many ways. And I think when you get very old, which I am, you get that opportunity to sort of look back in your career and identify the crossroads where you made a decision. And so I've done a fair bit of that of late. And if I go right back into childhood, I adored my father. My father was the most important person really for me. And I would take any opportunity to be with my father. And he was a great shot. So he would go out and he would shoot pigeons and rabbits and deer, and we'd take them home and mother would cook them. And my mother was squeamish. So to be able to sit with my father at the back door and skin rabbits or grillach a deer or, you know, pluck pheasants just seemed perfectly normal for a 6-year-old. So when I was 12, my father said to me, what job are you going to get? And I thought he meant when I grew up, but he meant when I was 12. And so whilst all my school friends were selling makeup in, you know, a pharmacy or selling fashion in a shop, my job was in a butcher shop. So I worked every single Saturday and weekend in a butcher shop. So when I got to university, going into something like the anatomy department, I was already very comfortable with skin and muscle and bone, and it felt just like a natural step. And when I got to my 4th year, you had to do a research project. And I'm pathologically terrified of rodents, anything, mice, rats, hamsters, gerbils, just no, absolutely no. And all the research projects, you know, involved things like lead levels in rat brain or carcinoma and hamster pituitary. And I could not pick a dead mouse out of a bucket. And so I went to the department and said, what else can I do? And they said, well, why don't you look at identification from the human skeleton? So my research then went into that area. So when a case first came along, I was in the right place at the right time with the right set of skills So no planning. I wish I could say I planned this is what I want to do, because that's what all career teachers want you to say. I had no idea where I was going, but I found myself in a really comfortable place with something that I really enjoyed doing. And I think that's terribly important.
It's quite funny though, because when I was growing up, I always thought as well that you should have a plan, but in all the STEM interviews that I've done, everybody has said exactly what you did. They didn't have a plan. They were right place, right time.
When I took the professor's job at Dundee when I was in my 40s, my father turned round to me and said, "Have you decided yet what it is you're going to do when you leave school?" Because as far as he was concerned, being in university was still being in school. And the honest truth is I've never chosen to do what I do. I've just been in the right place at the right time, and that's incredibly fortunate.
One of the interesting things that I've found when speaking to different people and when I became more involved in STEM is how it's trying to diversify. So you were saying that you were quite different from the other people in your school because you were working in the butchers. How has the landscape for women in STEM changed in your time since you've got involved in it? Because I know there's been a big push to get more females involved in STEM.
There's been a real push, but in many ways, the field that I'm in is very different. So when I had my classes in Dundee, almost 100% of my student intake were female. So forensic science, for whatever reason, is a real attractant for young women. And what I've also found is that when you look at that pipeline of coming in at the bottom and rising all the way through promotion to the top, there is no barrier for women in forensic science. So you're as likely to get to the top as any man. And that's not true in all of the STEM subjects. It's much more challenging. Still, I'm afraid to say, for young girls who want to go into mathematics or physics or chemistry, they're still very much viewed as being a man's science rather than a woman's science. Biology has always attracted more women than it has men, but forensic science really seems to attract women. And I'm sure there's a research project in there that would allow us to try and figure out why, but I don't know what it is. I think our approaches to diversity in science are changing, but I think we also have to be careful that we don't force people into a STEM subject, perhaps where they don't really want to go, but they feel that they should be. And there should never be barriers. There should never be a glass ceiling that says you can't do this because you're a boy, you can't do this because you're a girl. But I think there is also still a natural selection that whether, it will take many generations to remove if we ever do. But I think biology does attract girls more than perhaps chemistry or physics does, but there shouldn't be a barrier for those who want to get into those subjects. And I think we've got a greater acceptance these days now of that diversity, but we've still got a long way to go.
And I'm going to pull that into your current role then with the engagement. So as a big part of what you do then with engaging people is letting them know about these opportunities, but as you say, not shoehorning people into certain subjects.
It's about trying to find, particularly when we're talking to young people, is allowing them to have the confidence of knowing in their own heart and their own head who they want to become, not what they want to become, because that's a job, but who they want to become. And there is then, I think, a natural tendency to drift towards those subjects that really interest you. And one of the things I've always said to all of my students is when you're trying to figure out what you want to do, get a blank piece of paper, put a line down the middle, and have a list of all the things you really love doing, but also have a list of the things you hate doing. And, why would you want a career that involves anything that's on that side of the paper? Because you're going to be working for 40 and more years of your life. You want to be able to do something that makes you want to get up in the morning, that makes you want to go and do it. And it shouldn't feel like a job at all. It should feel that it's a real sort of pleasure and a blessing because you're doing what you really want to do and what you feel is right for you. We do have a tendency, I think, still to shoehorn people into job titles. But I think that concept of a job for life has now gone. Whereas, my father might expect to be in that job for the whole of his adult career. Now, probably in our lifetime, we'll have 6 or 7 different careers. But that makes us so much more interesting because we're not one-dimensional anymore. We've got people who did medicine who've become jewelry designers, you know, and that combination of that artistic fulfillment as well as that scientific application, I think is where humans really do excel. And we've got to break away from those barriers of pigeonholing people into where we think they should go.
And you've been lucky enough with your career, which it's clear from just talking to you, how much you enjoy and love what you do. And you've had great opportunities like working for the BBC on History Cold Case. So how did working on a television programme differ from working as a forensic anthropologist in the field?
So bless them, but I hated every moment of it. So what I love is I love radio. I love being able to create pictures with words. And I refuse to look at myself on television. I just absolutely hate it. So as we're talking, I look at you, I never look at myself because I just hate it. And so television for me was a really alien environment. And I'd done a fair bit of it before BBC. So when we were out looking at the war crimes investigations in Kosovo, we had a team come out with us from Panorama. And what I'd said to them was, they were filming me then in my real job. And I said, we don't do second takes. You know, I'm working, you capture it or too bad. And there was only one occasion where the producer said to me, can you just do that again? And I looked at him and he went, I know, but it was just so important. And so I liked the television that was immediate and that there was no, let's do it again. But when it came to History Cold Case, I mean, bless them. I think they had me walking across a field in Baldock on a sort of January morning in the frost. I think I walked across that field 25 times for them to record it, to use about a nanosecond in the final piece. And so I'm clearly not destined to be on television because I get bored really quickly and I get really frustrated at having to retake and retake and retake. But we got a tremendous response from it. And the BBC in particular, because we were on BBC Two, said that I think they had about 2.5 million viewers a night. And the demographic shifted for BBC Two. So suddenly what we had was a lot more women and a lot more young girls watching television BBC Two because that sort of forensic element really appealed to them. So there's a real value in doing television because where it is educational, it does get to a different audience, but it's not for me. I'd much rather do radio any day.
And I'm now going to link that on because that goes really nicely into the writing part, because then of course you're not being visible, but you can still paint these pictures with words. Now, being a forensic anthropologist and having to deal with dead bodies and be in war zones and natural disasters could be a very morbid subject, which you managed to not make it morbid in your books. In fact, I found it quite uplifting when I read them. But what encouraged you to write about your experiences in All That Remains and Written in Bone?
So I had, first of all, like everything else, I had no intention of doing that, absolutely none. But I had an agent for an entirely different project. And he press ganged me. He came at me with a publisher that said, we want you to write this, but we don't just want you to write a case book. We want you to write something that gives your perspective on death, because you deal with death every single day. And somebody had asked me, what's the book that you would like to read that you never will? And I thought that was a great question. And the answer for me was, I would have loved to have read a book about my grandmother's life, because my grandmother was born in Glenelg in the middle of the West Coast in the 1800s. I have no idea what her life was like. And of course, I can't ask her anymore because she's no longer with us. And so it got me to thinking that, inside all of us, we've got our stories. We've got our stories about our lives, and we should put them down because we might not want to read them. But I suspect generations of our own children or our own grandchildren might. So in my mind, I had written particularly All That Remains with my children in mind, in the hope that they would read it, or my grandchildren would, in time that would allow them to understand me a little bit better. So they were what I had. Now, when the first edition of the book came out, which is before it was published, you get the sort of draft copy, I got a copy for each of my girls. And I wrote a very long, what I thought was a lovely piece, you know, from a mother to her daughter. And they all got a copy of the book. And, you know, the little witches, and they are witches, all three of them, they've never read the book. But what they did was they went to the index at the back to find the bits with their name, and they've read the bits of the book about them, which I thought was just wonderful. So they have no interest in my life, but they wanted to see what I'd written about them. And I thought, well, you know, isn't that just typical? You know, I wrote it for you lot, and here we are. And I genuinely believed that nobody else would read it. I hadn't thought for a moment, and there's a real naivety on my part in there, that I didn't think anybody else would find it remotely interesting, because I wrote it for them and I wrote it for my grandchildren, just so that my voice was inside their head, if you know what I mean. And so it's been a revelation that people have wanted to read it. And the honest truth is, if I could go back and rewrite it, I probably would rewrite it differently, because I'd be writing for a different audience, but maybe it wouldn't work as well, because it really was telling my children what it feels like to live alongside death and to work with death every single day of your life, but not to be afraid of it.
Yeah, that's what I meant by it came across as very uplifting, even though it's a morbid subject. And I agree, maybe if you went back and rewrote it, it wouldn't have the same impact. One of the reviews I read on it had actually said, it was on Amazon, it said, "Thank you for letting me see into the next chapter and not fear it anymore," which I thought was a lovely review.
There was a lovely gentleman that I met at one of the sort of book festivals, and he came up and he was just so effusive in his thanks. And the reason that he did was when his mother was dying and he was by her bedside, somebody said something and he laughed, and he'd felt guilty for the last 10 years or more of being at his mother's bedside and laughing. And in All That Remains, one of the things I talk about is my mother's death. And my mother went into pretty much a coma towards the end of her life. And two of my daughters and I were up visiting her, which was the last time that we would see her. And I thought, well, you know, she can't communicate with us, but maybe she can hear us, because they do say hearing is something that is retained. And I thought, what would my mother like to hear? Well, she'd love to hear us singing. So I think we sang every Disney song that we could remember, and Christmas carols. And I think we even did, for those who are in Scotland, you kind of shove your granny off a bus, which is not appropriate, you know, really, when it's their grandmother's deathbed. And we laughed. We just laughed. And I thought, you know, if you're going to go out of life, wouldn't you want to hear your family singing, laughing, you know, clearly loving being in the room with you, rather than, you know, being upset and crying? And so when I'd written that in All That Remains, he came back and said, I felt guilty for so long. Actually, I don't feel guilty anymore, because maybe the last thing my mother heard was my laughter. And that's what she gave me, was my laughter. And you think, gosh, I just never anticipated that what I would write could affect other people's lives.
And as I said in the introduction as well, so you've written about your life and your experiences, and obviously touched people with that book, but you've also advised crime authors to try and get the forensics part of their books accurate. Would you ever consider writing your own crime novels with your experience?
No, absolutely not. I promised Val McDermid I'd never write a crime novel. And part of the reason for that is I don't think I'm a good storyteller. I think I can tell factual stories, but I don't think I'm a creative storyteller. And I have such respect for somebody who has an idea of a story and creates a book and holds you with that book all the way through. I don't think I have that skills. A part of me also worried that if I wrote something that was fiction, there would probably be a bit of somebody's truth in there as well, because I'd have to draw on my own experience, and I didn't really wanted to do that. So the sort of halfway house was being able to talk to the crime writers. And some of them, I have to say, I have tremendous respect for them, in that they respect their readers, and they want their readers to get as authentic an experience as they can. So they research it, and they research it really well. And so they'll send me a section of a chapter and say, is that what you do? Is that what you'd say? Is this the right thing? Is there a different way we could put it? And I like that ability to almost dip my toe in their waters, but not actually have to stick my whole body in, if you know what I mean.
Plus,
so
Val McDermid, plus Val McDermid would be tough competition, because she writes a great crime book.
She does, and she's been a tremendous friend for many years, and we have a really interesting relationship in that, you know, we'll meet up somewhere, maybe in a coffee bar or something, and we'll have normal chit chat about, you know, how's her family, how's my family, and then she'll talk about what it is she's writing, and she'll say something along the lines like, you know, I need to be able to see this or do that. How would that happen? And so the pair of us, without us realizing, will be in a coffee shop talking about the most gruesome aspects of, you know, crime and murder and all sorts of things, and the people around you forget about. And so some people will just get up and leave, but what you'll also find is some other people keep getting closer and closer because they want to hear what you're saying. And so we've had some absolute tremendous fun in terms of just, you know, the kind of author and I don't call myself an advisor to her, but a sounding board in many ways. And I have great respect, not just for Val, but that there are so many. Stuart MacBride as well. You know, I do the same for him. It's just such a pleasure to be able to read their books and to be able to help a little bit.
And it was great when they were then also able to help you when you were raising funding for Dundee University, which is one of the funny anecdotes, I hope you don't mind me sharing, from All That Remains, about the naming of the mortuary going to be named after the author with the most votes from the public. And at one point there was a very real prospect it could be called the Child Mortuary after Lee Child.
Yeah. So it's lit. So we needed to raise a lot of funds to build a new mortuary, and we were trying to be creative. Where do you raise funds for a mortuary? You know, you can't rattle a bucket at the supermarket, can you? And so it was a very dear friend of mine who said, you know, tell me who's been using your skills all their life, and let's see if we can get them to turn the tables and help you out. And of course I said, well, Val McDermid. And so I went to Val, and she very, very generously identified 9 of her crime writers. And so they became competitive in the nicest possible sense. And what I said is, whoever raises the most money for me, I'll name my mortuary after you. Now, Val was never going to let anybody else win anyway, was she? She really wasn't. But Stuart MacBride got really close because he produced a book called Skeleton Bob that we could sell just before Christmas that year. And so we had the MacBride dissecting room named after Stuart, but we had the Val McDermid mortuary. But each of the tanks that we had where our bodies are used for embalming, we named after each of the crime writers. And when we were talking to Lee Child, I said to Lee, you know, really, if you do win this, we can't call it the Child Mortuary. And he gave us permission, if he did win, to call it the Reacher Mortuary after Jack Reacher. So there is a tank that has the label of Jack Reacher on it instead of Lee Child.
And did you save a tank for yourself? Because I know you named one after a professor. I
did, which was one of my dearest friends, Roger, who was the principal anatomist. And when he retired, you think, well, what do you give an anatomist when they retire? And we thought, well, we'll name a tank after him. So we had the Roger Soames tank. And of course, the number of people who would come into the mortuary and go, oh, Roger hasn't died, has he? Thinking he was in the tank. And we went, no, we just named the tank after him. But no, I don't have my own tank.
So from growing up in the Highlands, all the way through this distinguished career that we've spoken about, to Buckingham Palace and becoming a dame, and recently becoming a member of the House of Lords, quite a long distinguished career. What is a highlight to you from that career? Does anything stand out as a great moment?
I think there's always something in your life that becomes a turning point. And it came for me in Kosovo. So with the war crimes investigations in Kosovo, some of the things that we saw were truly horrendous. And one in particular, which I won't go into detail here because it's not appropriate to do that, but anyone who reads All That Remains will find it, was a man who lost his entire family. So his wife, her sister, their mother, and their 8 children. And our job was to try to return these remains to that man. He lost everything. You know, every single member of his family was killed that day, and he survived. And it was my husband who said to me, how do you go forward? He said, if it was me and I lost you and I lost our girls, how do I go forward? And this man was just so determined that all of his family could be returned to him so they could all have their own grave, that it was just that moment in life where you felt you were in the right place at the right time, that you could help somebody achieve something that at that time nobody else could have done, because we'd just written the textbook literally on how to do that. And his humility and his humanity in the depths of those dreadful situations that he was in taught you what's important about life. And so I came back from Kosovo a changed person, in that I knew how fortunate I was that I could hug my children every night before they went to bed. He couldn't do that anymore. You know, how fortunate I was that my husband was there, because that man's wife wasn't anymore. And, you know, I got to a point where I think, do I care if there's a scratch on the car? No. Do I care if I didn't put the Hoover around the carpet? No. But I do care that my children get a song every night that we sing before we go to bed. They get a story, they get a hug. Those kind of things about family then became so important to me. And it was where my personal and my professional life really sort of interlocked together, and one really changed the perception of the other.
So we've said there about obviously not fearing death, and then you've had that moment with that man's loss impacting your life and how you view things and completely changing your perspective. It's quite an interesting, not so much a shift, but difference in way of looking at things. But I'm going to try and end us on a slightly more upbeat note. Do you have any advice for children and young people out there who may be interested in STEM but aren't sure how to pursue that interest or where it can lead?
I think that the most important thing for me is don't force yourself into something too swiftly. So, you know, take your time. There is this thing that says you need to go to school, of course, and then you need to go to college, or you need to go to university, and then you need to do. You don't have to do it that way. You can go out and you can work in the world for a year, 5 years, 10 years. And maybe by then you'll have some idea of what it is you really want to do. Find what's in your heart, find what's in your head. And if you can make those your job, then, you know, it'll never feel like you work for a single day in your life. And I know that sounds terribly Pollyanna, as if your glass is half full, but we only have one chance at living. So why would we want to do things that don't make us happy? Because happiness is the most important thing. And finding that is much more important than finding a job that makes you unhappy. Listen to your heart, listen to your head, take the advice from the people around you, but you need to follow what's right for you, because this is your life.
And what a brilliant way for us to end on that nice uplifting note about finding your happiness. Dame Sue Black, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's just been my pleasure, and I could talk to you for hours. So thank you so much indeed.